Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. How are you?
Evening, Dan.
Tizzy just texted and said she's having some tech issues, so she'll jump on when she can, which will be soon, but she said she'll try to join from her phone and then switch to her computer.
Haley, did Tizzy said to just get started without her?
Yep.
Okay. I welcome everyone. I do not have the agenda in front of me. Is the first item on the agenda just to talk about the settlement? Haley, is that?
I was
number
muted,
one?
sorry. Yep, I'll just go to the next slide. So it was just to run through some of these logistical things. First, so the most important one is just if consortium members could put their names in the chat to count roll call, that would be great. And note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted likely on our Facebook page.
Anything else, Haley, before we just jump into it?
Nope.
Okay. What the consortium members had asked me to do after our last meeting was to try to, at this meeting, give a little bit more detailed discussion of the terms of the settlement and how it might overlap specifically with some of the proposals that have been getting discussed in the consortium's working groups, just so that we might be able to discuss today and at a future meeting if necessary, how our work in the short and long term might be impacted by the settlement. So I've had a chance to talk to Karen Lance from the ACLU about it, who was very helpful, and take a look at it myself. And what I'm going to try to do, keeping in mind that time is short and that we did have some discussion of it at our last meeting, just try to run through it and talk about it in that context. And I saw just from peeking at the participants list that there are other people who probably know better than I do the details of it, including Secretary Bunting and folks from the Office of Management and Budget who are also in the meeting. So if I either get something wrong or leave something material out, which is a possibility, please feel free to jump in and correct me if necessary. So let me just talk about the settlement. It was an education funding lawsuit. So as is appropriate, the settlement is largely focused on funding for state funding for public education, and just in terms of dollars, by far the largest part of the settlement is the agreement that the governor has made pending the General Assembly's approval to both increase state funding for opportunity funds and to make those funds a permanent part of the state's budget process rather than something that is discretionary with the governor each year when he proposes his budget. And those the amount of those funds goes up immediately starting in next year's proposed budget from the current amount of $20 million a year to $35 million a year, which is substantial, obviously. And then that gradually increases over the course of years up to $60 million for the 2024-2025 school year. And the funding is permanent, and there's a formula that's built into the settlement for how it ought to increase in years subsequent to that when the dollar figures are no longer specifically laid out in the settlement agreement. $5 million of those funds, of those opportunity funds under the settlement agreement language, have to go to schools that have a specified minimum number of students who are either English language learners or are categorized as low income. And there's also some language in the settlement agreement that requires that individual school districts target those opportunity funds at the actual schools whose student populations generate their entitlement to the funds. But that particular requirement that the funds go to the individual schools is one that the school boards can waive if they have a vote on it at a public school board meeting. And then finally, with respect to those opportunity funds, there are requirements built into the settlement that neither the state nor the local school districts essentially swap those funds in for money that they are already spending that is targeted at those students. So it's not supposed to supplant any existing funding. So that's sort of a quick rundown of the dollars and cents and how it fits in. It's obviously a significant amount of money. It's significant that it's permanent. It's also, I think at least, almost impossible to predict what it's actually going to look like in terms of how it rolls out at the individual school and school district level. The local districts have a lot of discretion about how to use those opportunity funds. And even in the brief experience that we have had with them, we have seen different districts use them in very different ways, just depending upon what they perceive to be their most pressing needs and how they can best help their kids. So if you even look at what some of the school districts that we've been talking about on the consortium, how they have used those opportunity funds in the years where they've already had them. For the last school year, Christina, it looks like, spent about 65% of their opportunity funds in three very specific areas: 8 instructional coaches for teachers, 8 paraprofessionals for students who go to Stubbs, and 4 ESL instructors is what Christina spent about 2/3 of its money on. Red Clay spent about 2/3 of its opportunity funds on increasing staffing in particular schools targeted at helping low-income and English language learner students. And Colonial used its opportunity funds in a very different way. It spread them out among in smaller amounts among a variety of other programs that were targeted at helping define groups of kids. I think their biggest expenditure was about $240,000 on a summer enrichment program for targeted middle school students. So that's just by way of illustration that different districts have used the funds in very different ways, and that makes it hard to predict what they would use the increase in funds for. One other thing to keep in mind in terms of what this means, an increase of $15 million in the coming school year in the opportunity funds, is just sort of the order of magnitude of what the state currently spends on public education state funding for districts and charters. It's about a $1.5 billion expenditure, just the state portion of district and charter school funding. So a $15 million increase it's certainly significant, particularly because it's going to be targeted at particular groups of students within those schools and school districts. But just to put it in terms of context, it's $15 million out of a very large budget. And I guess the last thing to think about, and there was some discussion of this at our last meeting, is again, this is in terms of predicting what this money is going to actually look like when it's spent at the school and district level. The fact that it is permanent money now and not year to year is, for some districts at least, likely to impact how they decide to spend it. because you can do longer term programs and potentially recruit and hold on to different personnel when you know that the funding is going to be there year after year, and that people don't have to worry about having contracts that may expire at the end of a particular year. So, all of those things in combination, I guess, in terms of what it, how it matches up with the consortium's goals that it's discussed to date, is that, again, it is an unvarnished good thing, that significant of an increase of funds going towards that population of kids. Undeniably a good thing, and undeniably puts those kids in a better place than they were before. But in my opinion, at least, very difficult to predict exactly how it will impact the areas, the specific subject matter areas that the consortium has been talking about. So that's the opportunity funds. A couple areas where the settlement does overlap in a more precise way with some of the consortium's priorities that it's been discussing. One is ECAP funding. The Social Determinants Working Group has been talking about the importance of education for kids birth to 5, and the settlement commits the governor to proposing to double ECAP funding for the 2024 fiscal year, from 6.1 to 12.2 million dollars. That's a budget that he will be, if reelected, that he will be proposing 2 years from January. So that is some ways into the future, obviously. And along the same lines, he's proposed adding $4 million to enhance teacher recruitment and retention in high needs schools starting in fiscal year 2023. And that's a 3-year commitment. But that's a budget that he'll be proposing a year from January. And again, an area where our education working group has been focused and has identified as a priority. So those are both areas, both birth to 5 via ECAP and recruitment and retention of teachers for high needs schools. Both areas where we have been talking about making recommendations to the governor and legislature. In both of those areas, in terms of what we've been discussing as a consortium, which is making recommendations for the budget that the legislature and governor will be talking about starting in January, the settlement doesn't necessarily impact those, because both of those areas, what the settlement talks about is commitments that wouldn't really go into effect for at least a year from this January. A couple other areas where there is some direct overlap. The governor has agreed to propose funding for, and I'm quoting from the settlement agreement, a holistic assessment of the Delaware public school financing to consider total funding levels, mechanisms for raising and distributing education revenue at the state and local level, and recommendations for improvements to equity and efficiency. That's to be done by an independent agency, and it's to be completed by January of 2024, which is 3 years from this January. So there's obviously an overlap between those issues and some of the issues that have been getting discussed by our funding working group. But there's an extended timeline on that. That's a report that is not under the settlement agreement, due to come back to the state until 3 years from January.
Matt?
Final, yeah.
Sorry, I see Secretary Bunting has her hand raised.
Oh, well, I invited her to correct me, so this may be coming.
I only wanted to emphasize back on the opportunity funding that there is an application process that districts go through. I have no indication that won't continue to be the process. We are very, very strict about each item on that application directly addressing the needs of low income and English learner students. So it really has to be targeted. We were hoping through 3 different evaluation processes to be able to show the effects of that investment. We did not have a close to our school year with testing last year, but we do have an oversight committee that looks at what happens with that money and reports back. We also have an outside organization. RAND is doing an evaluation. In fact, the first year's evaluation is in the proofing stage. I read it over the weekend, and the draft will be back to us soon as a finished product. And then each superintendent has targets that are set for increasing the proficiency of English learners and low-income students. And there is an annual process just as we have for our teaching staff, where they set a target based on the current proficiency level and look at where we need to be according to our ESSA plan by 2030, and start chipping away at the progress that those two subgroups happen to make. And then we do mid-year conferences and end-of-year conferences. So it's an involved process, but it truly is targeting those two subgroups who haven't traditionally performed as well as other groups have in our system.
Thanks. Let me, I'm almost done in terms of the settlement. So let me just run through the rest of it, and then I can turn things back over to Senator Lockman. One other change that overlaps with concerns that have been raised, at least in one of our working groups, is the creation, and this is something that's supposed to happen for the next school year, of an ombudsperson program in each of the 3 counties to focus on interventions with school districts to resolve disputes that relate to disparities in student discipline, disparities in access to school programs, or other disparities that may arise. And that's something that, again, is supposed to be done by an independent entity that's going to be contracted out through the state contracting process. And there's no dollar figure in the settlement agreement set for that, but there's a commitment to do it for the upcoming school year. The Department of Education is going to amend its regulations to require districts to submit an equity statement that identifies the demographic information about students who are supposed to either attend or otherwise benefit from new facilities that the districts want to create. The settlement agreement doesn't say what, if anything, the department is supposed to do with that information once it's provided, but it does require that it be provided. And then finally, the settlement requires that starting in the 2023-2024 school year, that the budget that the governor submits for that school year is going to provide for a funding structure for special education for grades K to 3 that mirrors the structure for grades 4 through 12. So that would be part of the governor's proposed budget that he would put forward 2 years from this January. So that is that's sort of a rundown of the substance of the settlement agreement. There's some other provisions in there in terms of enforcement and what happens if different parties don't comply with their obligations under it. But that is the substance of it. And as mentioned, there's some parts of it that overlap very directly with some of the discussions that we've been having. Other parts of it that may or may not, and we probably won't know until, as Secretary Bunning was indicating, we see the actual proposals from the districts as to how specifically they propose to use that money. And as she indicated, they're required to use it in a way that is targeted at low income and English language learner students. But there are obviously a variety of different ways that different districts have that they think is best suited for their districts to do that. So I that's kind of a rundown on the settlement. If folks have questions about it, I am happy to try to field them or kick them to Secretary Bunting, since I know that her hand up button is working. And if not, I don't know if Haley, was Senator Lockman able to
I am. I'm here.
Oh, then I will happily turn things over to you.
That was great. I think we can't hear the rundown enough, and I think especially couching it in the timeline is helpful, because I think everyone feels a lot of urgency about our response to this, and it just helps to remember a bit staggered. So thank you for that. And I want to, if we have interest, provide the opportunity. I see we have a lot of folks, but we particularly have a lot of consortium members, which is wonderful. But we did build in 2 public comment periods today, because we really wanted to hear from non-consortium members in terms of your thoughts, any suggestions or, sort of non-question commentary you'd like to offer us. So we actually do have, if you've looked at our agenda, have some time now if we have any non-consortium members who would like to weigh in before we move into the consideration of the 2 big questions for our consortium members to discuss for the rest of the hour. So I don't know, Haley, if you can see any hands, if we've got anyone or anyone just wants to pipe up. We have a little bit of time for any thoughts. Anyone would like to, Paul?
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome, Paul Herdman.
Hi, my name is Paul Herdman. I think I know a lot of you. I head up Rodell, a nonprofit that supports public education here in Delaware. And I guess a couple of thanks and then a couple of comments and a couple of suggestions or questions to raise. So first of all, a thanks to all the plaintiffs, Jay and Freeman and the ACLU for kind of putting us on a forward foot. And also a thanks to, Dr. Bunting and the governor, because I know when the governor said last week that the aspirations of the plaintiffs were aligned with his, having worked with both of them for many years, I know that that's true. But I think we also heard last week, and I think, Matt, you alluded to it a little bit, that this should really be seen as the floor, not the ceiling of the work ahead. And so the two metaphors, and I apologize, one's a baking metaphor, another one's a plumbing metaphor, to explain kind of where we are. On the baking metaphor, I look at the funding system as kind of a cake. And 95% of that cake is still the unit count. Now we've added potentially, even with the 60 million a few years out, a 5% bit of icing on top of the cake. But the core system is still the unit count. So we have not really changed the fundamental system that the lawsuit was looking to address. So this gets to the plumbing metaphor. I know a number of folks, and I've talked to a lot of superintendents over time, who almost take it personal when I critique the unit count system. And I kind of look at it like when a contractor comes to your house and says, listen, your plumbing has to be fixed. And the reality is, if you don't fix it, you're going to get water in your basement. In our case, the implications are a lot more serious. We're affecting generations of kids. And we've had a lot of contractors come in and tell us that the unit count is an inefficient and ineffective system. We've heard from folks like Marguerite Rosa from Georgetown University. We've heard from Andreas Schleicher, who does international work, that says systems should be, the highest performing systems in the world are designed around systems that look at the needs of individual students. And we had this ACLU suit, which put forward a lot of data and expert testimony. And Judge Laster, who I would say is almost like the inspector general in this contracting analogy, basically put forward one of the longest responses, opinions to shooting down the state's case to try and dismiss this, in essence saying that the current system isn't working for kids. It may make sense for predictability because we've done it for close to 80 years. But the challenge is that we have an issue in terms of the core funding system. And it kind of feels like we're in a situation where we're a homeowner where we've put duct tape on our plumbing for year after year, and we think we can just kind of make it through one more year. I feel like this is our window of opportunity to actually do something significant. And I feel like we don't want to be looking at kids that are born today and say, we have a funding system that is literally a century old. Most states have changed their system multiple times within this time period. So the two questions are, one is my hope or question is that in taking this as a floor versus a ceiling, that we actually look at the underlying system in addition to the icing, we look at the cake and think about a thoughtful process to kind of modernize our system. While we have this window of opportunity open, because it's taken us 80 years to get here, I'm not sure when it's going to open again. And two, in terms of the holistic assessment, I would just raise the question, given that we have 3 years of lots of data and lots of expert testimony, and we're going to have a RAND study, what additional information we need. Can we just build on that rather than waiting 3 years to do another evaluation? So those are just some questions that I hope get put in the mix, to look at the cake and to think about, using the data that we've already got as a starting point as we think about evaluation, because we've already heard clearly where the judicial branch of this was heading. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Would anyone else outside of the consortium like to comment before we move on? Okay. All right. So I think we can, there we go. So as we know, we are not expecting in the next 30 minutes to come up with the actual answers in terms of structural reforms and the like, but we do want to be getting ahead of the work in the sense of making sure that Reading is poised to play the right role and be structured to do that effectively. So that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, and would really like to actively hear from folks, your questions, your observations, your concerns, and your hopes for how exactly we're going to do that. So to that point, we really reduced it just to two questions that we wanted everyone to consider, and to sort of guide us in what we do in the next steps to respond effectively. So here are the two, these are it. This is the two questions. How are we structured to respond to the settlement? So of course, begging the question of should we adjust structure? And how does the work align with the points reflected in the lawsuit? So I think Matt spoke a bit to that in terms of, what are some things that we're already working on that just simply make sense to be aligned and continue in the same structure. So to consider, to those points, we can look at the work groups that we already have existing. We can think about the ways that we could sort of break up the points of the settlement and have those work groups continue in the same way that they have done to address the relevant pieces of the settlement, and where we could look at alternatives. We can form a specific additional work group focused broadly on the settlement in its entirety. And then of course, we also just want to be thinking about, what are some limitations that we might want to take into account to our scope, and in what way does that impact what's appropriate in terms of a role for us to serve in relationship to advising the General Assembly specifically, which is where we are on the response and follow through to the settlement terms. Since of course we know that we're tied geographically to Wilmington and North Newcastle County, we have worked on other proposals with a wider scope, but our mandate is narrow in that way. So broad questions. I hope folks are ready to speak on it, because we don't have a lecture to go with that. We really just want to hear from our members in terms of your thoughts, so that we can, get to work responding to them. So is there anyone who would like to weigh in terms of, what do we think? Do we think we should continue with the structure that we have? I think the main point that was brought up at Thursday's meeting was this idea of forming a dedicated work group to just focus on follow through from the settlement. But we are, of course, open to ideas and thoughts on any dimensions of what's come up in the meeting up until this point. So anyone like to venture a thought?
Senator Lockman,
Yes.
from the structure standpoint, would you consider this potential subgroup, maybe a subgroup of the governance work group, focused specifically on developing maybe legislative priorities around the settlement? Is that your vision potentially?
I mean, we're here to brainstorm, so I think that's definitely an option. I think when I was thinking a new work group, I was thinking of it as a fourth work group, but perhaps that's a more elegant way to approach it. Haley, you might have some thoughts on that, because we do have, we don't have endless capacity in terms of our IPA and our DSU team. So possibly as a subgroup of funding and governance, I think that's certainly one way to approach it, because probably we'd have a lot of the same folks who'd want to be a part of that conversation, I would think. And Haley, do you have handy the members of that work group in terms of what, we know we have representation from all of our Northern Newcastle County school districts. And perhaps you want to touch on some of the other membership, because we want to be mindful of having the right folks around the table of any subgroup or new group.
Right. I have, I'm sharing my screen right now, so I can't pull up the membership document, but yeah.
Can I ask?
Oh,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tika.
Can I ask a question about the work groups? Because we originally started with a certain number of them and focusing on certain priorities, and we've kind of changed a little bit along the way, added and removed. So is the expectation, so for instance, like with the educators work group, after they've made their recommendations, will they continue to work on other things, or would they kind of dismantle and funnel back into the other work groups? Are these standing work groups?
Great question. So we have been pretty committed from the beginning in saying we do not have standing committees that just, sit there and meet to meet, that we wanted to be focused on action items and deliverables. So when, a work group sort of reaches its goals, that's the moment where we can consider disbanding it or continuing it. We sort of did that. The educators work group had a touch point in spring, just after the pandemic started, where they could have disbanded and decided to continue for a bit longer. So there's a strong possibility that they would see this as an opportunity to, to back burner as a working group. So we do, yeah, I think it's flexible. It's meant to be focused on actionable deliverables, not standing committees.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
and Kelly just popped the funding governance. Oh, she just sent it to me. I'll just copy and paste it.
Okay.
Everyone. Thank you, Kelly.
And
I see Matt has his hand raised too.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, not so much on whether we would or would not want to set up a separate working group, but just to the larger question of how should the settlement impact what we have been doing to date. My general thought is that we should be, each of the three working groups and the consortium should be full steam ahead and not really changing anything about targeted schedules or, priorities that they have been developing. And that's true, I think, generally and specifically for what we were trying to do for December. Because as we've been discussing, the bulk of the recommendations are things that the state is going to be funding in out years. And, in the interim, we have a budget coming up this year and kids with needs, who are out there right now. And we don't know exactly what the state's financial situation is going to be in December, January, March, April, May. But at a minimum, I think that we want to continue on the path that we have been on of, putting forward some very clear recommendations about what the state ought to be doing, in the current year's budget, in the budget that's being developed in the current year for the next fiscal year. And I don't see anything. I think the settlement is fantastic. And as I said earlier, unquestionably a plus. But I don't see anything in it that should deter us from encouraging the state to do some additional things in the short term if its finances allow.
Right. So we discussed staying full steam ahead on the priorities as we have determined them. I know, and the funding and governance work group has a pretty clear work plan in terms of priorities to offer proposals on in the funding space. So, and the membership of that group is in the chat. If anyone hasn't seen it, minus the Northern Newcastle County District CFOs who participate in that group as well. Oh, looks like we're getting an updated version of that list. But, and so that list does contain sort of as a longer range goal to look at essentially, I guess we would call it funding formula reform. That sort of more structural funding reform is on the docket for that work group. There's not really a specific timeline for that. I know that I've felt some urgency among my colleagues in terms of, hastening a timeline to address that, rather than thinking, okay, we have 2 years to work on this, that they're looking for some guidance and possibly even proposals in a much shorter time frame. So I think that's something that's important for us to be considering in terms of a response, and maybe even think about, what we think is realistic, and in terms of pivoting the timeline that has been laid out for that particular work group, where that, the deep stuff was not something that was expected to be worked on in the next few months or even within the next year. Does that feel like something that, there's many members of that work group specifically who are here. So I guess I'd like to hear from folks if that feels like a timeline that should be shortened or altered in some way in response to a settlement that is soon to be bringing more resources into the system, but maybe without some of those systemic changes that a lot of people are pretty, urgently wanting to see addressed.
Senator Lockman?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in that I really
Thank
think
you.
in some way, shape, or form that there should be and some type of alignment between the governance and funding workshop subgroup, and I don't know where it's a new group, or if we're just saying maybe it's a ad hoc or a part of this work, but I think it should be at least linked to our subcommittee. And then from there, I think it should be ongoing, and the discussions kind of marry the two. So I definitely think there is a relationship, and that there's a way to push forward from that subcommittee.
Okay. So I'm hearing, the possibility of it being a subgroup of that working group, which sounds like a lot of folks would, I think, want to be engaged in. So that probably sounds like that maybe is the easy part. It seems like a separate grouping of folks, but connected with that funding and governance. Makes sense.
And I would just say I'm in agreement in regards to this subgroup as well. I think that's the best way for us in moving forward. It also keeps us aligned within the actual working group itself, and we can make sure we're all on this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it would be additive, and I think to Matt's point, that work group would continue on the path that it had set. There's no stoppage in the current priorities to go do something else. It's
Absolutely. Agreed.
Is it possible to just do similar to what we did with the social determinants group, and just have the different subcommittees and then leaders of those committees as well, so everything is still going along simultaneously?
I would defer to the chairs on that one. Are you guys familiar with the way the social determinants work group has become structured?
I'm not fully.
I'm not as familiar.
I don't know if we have either chair here, but we do have Dawn and Tika, who could potentially, I thought we had Dawn. Okay, Dawn, you mute and describe, you're very familiar with it.
So do you want me to speak about the about the legislative recommendations, or do you want us to speak? What would you like, Tika? and-
Structurally, I think the question was how social determinants has structured itself to sort of have subgroupings with. specific-
Sure, absolutely. So we have 3 subgroups. We have a subgroup that is focusing on early childhood education and early childhood services. So really birth to 5 holistically. And then we have a work group, an educator work group, looking at educators who we currently have and how to attract educators of color, attract and retain, and a lot related to educator training. And then the third group is looking at wraparound services. So the kinds of services that we know that children and families need that may not be traditionally part of school.
There's also a group that focuses on racism and structural racism.
Mhm, mhm.
Thank
I
you.
think there's actually 4 groups. I'm not
Yeah,
sure if there's 3 or 4,
that's
but the
correct.
middle one might overlap in titling a little bit.
I don't know if Dr. Harrison is here, but he's leading a lot of the, he's.
Mhm.
keeping a
Good
ton.
evening. Good ening. This
Oh.
is Ray.
Oh, hey, Ray,
Thank
I
you,
didn't even see
Ray.
that you were
Hi,
here.
Ray.
You are a chair of the
Yay.
Yeah.
group,
You can
so-
explain it better.
So there are 3 small groups under social determinant. The educator diversity work group is, as you know, is an educator subgroup itself.
Mhm.
So it's the group that Dawn is leading around whole child equity, starting with early learning, the wraparound services and partnerships for in-school, out-of-school, and summer supports, and the racial justice and education small group led by Roger Harrison and Yasser Payne.
Right. So essentially, you identified leaders internal to the overall work group who are leading on specific buckets of work. So then I guess the charge would be that internal to the funding and governance work group, you would identify, I would think probably more than one point person to lead on settlement oversight and recommendation building. For, obviously on behalf of the work group and then on behalf of the consortium, but ultimately be vetted on those levels, of course.
Sure, I guess we just have to have that conversation with the individuals from within our work group, just to make sure we have the leadership in order to move forward. If someone has the time and things of that nature and able to do so moving forward, so I'm open to having that conversation.
I believe it was posed to, in an email format to each of the members of our work group if we were interested in leading one of those subgroups, and then people responded and then they built it out from there.
Mhm. Okay, that's good. Noelle, did you want to voice your question from the chat?
Yeah, I already hear like some, and we've had an issue with this in the work groups, just talking about like, is this something that the funding and governance work group is working on? Is this something the social determinants working on? Sometimes we have those questions, and I would just be wary of forming another group that we might continue to have like duplication of efforts, or because I think we're getting kind of down to the wire as far as like legislative session starting, and we wouldn't want people to have to start over. So I think we just have to have a clear reason for something that's in the settlement that can't possibly be covered by the other work groups. Because I'm also wondering if the settlement can be broken down based on like, for example, there's that whole portion that's directly to teacher recruitment and retention that could just be handled by the educator work group. It's what we've already been doing. And I'm wondering if there are other points that could be covered by the other 2 work groups, and we could just highlight that out, because I know getting another work group started, even if it's a subgroup, there's a time period of getting that together and thinking about what you're doing. And I don't know if there's time for us to do that efficiently.
Noelle, this is Dawn. I agree with you that and looking at the recommendations or looking at what's in the settlement, so 2 of the recommendations are associated with early childhood, so we could work on those in our work group. So if we can look, that makes sense, rather than start a new work group, see what we're able to address in the work that we're already doing.
Would it be helpful to continue this discussion, Haley, if you went back a slide for a second? Okay, maybe too.
I was gonna say, like, wait, what? Okay. I mean, I think certainly there has to be a linkage, and I guess I'm trying to think, does it make more sense for, us to look at this and say, okay, we're chunking it up into different work groups, or does it make sense to have a settlement group with representation from those work groups? I mean, there's a couple of different ways to slice that. Just wanted to, to think that through, because if we just sort of totally divide and conquer, we're still kind of siloed and could potentially, end up whether with duplication or just not necessarily enough on the same page. So I think there is some elegance in there being a single sort of, not a new entity, but a particular group focused on, and perhaps it makes more sense to just make sure we have significant draw from those other work groups to help make sure that there's, that we're aligning with what's already being done.
This is Tika again. I think the way that I thought that the separate settlement group would function would almost be to keep the other groups organized according to these key points. So not necessarily that they would be tackling all of those items, but in Dawn's example with the early education childhood, they would still continue to work on it. But the work group that's responsible for the settlement is the one ensuring that all those things are done, keeping it organized, keeping it floating along the way. I guess in my head, that's how I just perceived it.
Right. So whoever are the people in charge of leading that effort would be responsible for consulting with those other work groups that are doing that work, is what you're saying?
Like, I looked at that work group mainly as like the connectors to make, I mean, they could be doing some of the work too, but we obviously don't need to duplicate effort.
No.
So it's somebody there that's ensuring that whether it's, this piece is covered by the early education subgroup of this committee, or if this is covered under the funding, but it's just an entity that has oversight to make sure that the groups aren't missing anything and kind of just keeping it all tight knit, I guess, is how in my head I thought it was going to operate, or possibly could operate.
So rather than, tackling those issues broadly, they're making sure that the working groups are appropriately working on them. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, in relations to the specific points from the settlement. So, I mean, there's work that we've also discussed that it isn't necessarily a piece of the settlement. And so that would still take place too, but that work group would just really focus on ensuring those key pieces are still being addressed through each of the working groups.
Jim, you have a good question. Would you like to say it out loud?
I guess, yeah. So I'm slightly confused. When I think about the work that we started off with, we were making recommendations. The Reading Consortium was making recommendations that would go to the legislators on initially redistricting, and then we broke into these other work groups. But now that we've got this opportunity funding that's now increased, that goes through an application process through Dr. Bunning's office, I guess we're asking what's the role of the consortium, but does it still go through a process through the legislation if in fact it goes through an application process through the Secretary of Ed's office? I don't understand what we're asking.
I can answer from my perspective, and if anyone else disagrees, please voice it. My understanding is we are not trying to insert ourselves into the process of opportunity funding disbursement. I know there's a process there that, through which the districts have to work with the department to determine, what they will be utilizing those funds for. I think our focal point is legislative recommendations. So, the legislature is going to be looking for, I think, some guidance on, we talk a lot about this as a floor and not a ceiling. Are there additional things that we need to make sure that we are considering and making recommendations around, whether it's a funding formula, whether it's going further with early childhood, which Dawn can speak to, some of these other related policy recommendations to get our legislature to a comfort level with meeting, I think, the requirements of the settlement is where we should be. I mean, we are primarily a body focused on state level policymaking, legislative policymaking, and then of course also liaising with districts, but primarily we're about making recommendations for state resources and legislation at that level, not down to the district level choices around expenditure. Is that?
It is, but I guess, but in the way I'm hearing it, I guess, and that could be part of it when you're zoomed out by the end of the day.
Yes.
If we were going to look at what the consortium could do, or these work groups or subcommittees, however we frame it, then the recommendations would go to the legislature to make some sort of policy, right? Maybe that aligns the use of those funds with the policies or the legislation that they come up with. Because the funds are allocated, and then there's a process that kind of monitors that they're used in a proper manner. So are we looking for monitoring?
It could be monitoring. I mean, I think the things that I hear the most in terms of concerns about where folks might want to go that goes beyond just what we see in front of us on this list. It's, they're usually questions about accountability and, structural reforms, things that aren't given to us in this list, although there is, I don't know how you want to use the word windfall, but there's more funds flowing into the system now. And so my impression when I speak to my colleagues is people are like, well, there needs to be some guidelines, there needs to be some accountability, there needs to be reform of structures, those kinds of state level policymaking questions.
Okay.
I hear the most. And what I think folks are looking possibly to us and to others to weigh in on more than, the opportunity funding process, although perhaps there's room to make recommendations around that as well. That's not necessarily what I personally had in mind. My mind goes more to funding formula, goes more to, some of those other questions. Emily, you unmuted.
I did. Yes, Senator, thank you. I do absolutely think that there is some room to make recommendations around how the opportunity funding gets formalized or becomes permanent. We're talking about something that was basically just put in an epilogue section and, pretty broad parameters. There is some inconsistency in terms of cut points and funding eligibility that exists between the different pots. So I think looking at all of the funding recommendations holistically and making sure that the eligibility and that process is really kind of thought through as it moves from the 3-year pilot to the permanent status. I think there's a lot of room on the funding and governance work group for that to have some recommendations come through. I do agree that some of the stuff around the longer term holistic review of the funding structure, that's probably not the immediate work of the funding and governance subcommittee.
Okay, thank you. Did that help, Jim? Okay. Okay. Yes, please, Secretary.
I just wanted to add that the money currently is allocated on a per pupil basis. So you get a specific amount of money for each EL student and each low income student. So it's a very directed amount per student, a weighted funding system of sorts. That's not true for the $5 million of the 25 that we currently have, but for your basic amount, your main, we call it the flexible opportunity funding. It's done on a per pupil basis, just so you have that, as a guideline.
Thank you. I think Superintendent Holler. Link.
Yeah, just to Jim Simmons's point a minute ago, trying to find that line of what is the consortium's area of authority versus the Department of Education's, so that we're not at the end of the day looking at a direction set by the Department of Ed that is slightly different from the direction set by the consortium, and it should be one path. And I know I just pulled up State Bill 148, kind of read through the parameters of the consortium, and it clearly says you recommend policies and practices to the governor, General Assembly, and the Secretary of Education.
Yes.
So making sure that everything gets funneled through the Department of Education, so there is consistency in what districts are being asked and directed to do on behalf of the consortium and the Department of Education, not the Department of Education and then the consortium.
Yeah, okay. No, that's really helpful. And hold on, I'm looking at the composition of that work group and making sure that the department is appropriately represented on it. Okay. Those are some helpful thoughts. Anything else anyone has that they would like to weigh in? Dawn, I think you might have had some further thoughts you wanted to offer. And I know we're kind of getting down to our last 10 minute
Sure.
discussion time.
Well, our work group, our early childhood work group, has talked about the K-3 special education. So it's illogical to have kindergarten through 12th grade have 8.4 students to one teacher, to earn one teacher, yet to leave preschool at 12.8 children, so who are 3 and 4 year olds. So the request is we've talked about having it be pre-K through 3rd grade. So having that special education basic funding preschool through 12th grade. So include all of them. We have a lot of detail regarding that we can share with people. And we'll be sharing that tomorrow night at our subcommittee meeting. And then for early childhood, so there are ways to look at ECAP. So we know that this is the floor. So looking at the ECAP fund, strengthening ECAP, we've talked about looking at right now, it's a half day, and just really the requirements for ECAP. So strengthening the actual ECAP program and looking at equity related to how we enroll children and the services we offer to children, and then also increasing that funding and thinking about maybe being able to have children who are typical peers who are in 619 special education programs. We've talked a lot about how to increase access for, again, in talking about equity, increase access for children who are in schools, communities that are typically underserved and or have difficulty accessing high quality early learning programs. So we can share all that detail tomorrow night and on future meetings.
Okay, great. I see Link's hand still up. I think that's just a holdover. Oh, all right. Okay. Good. Matt, I think you're okay, right? Okay. All right. So it seems structurally that we have a good start, I think. No one seems to have a specific objection, obviously, to the idea that we pursue our role in responding to this. It's just a matter of how and with what sort of protocols. I think, yeah, being mindful that we're an advisory body to the governor, to the General Assembly, to the department, and working through the channels in that way. It was a great point. Structurally, I think we'll get started through the funding and governance work group to initiate that. But of course, we know that we've got opportunities for touching on specific line items of the settlement through our specific work groups. And is there anything else anyone feels the need outside of the structural question? Haley, you might want to advance the slide again to the questions. I don't remember them offhand. But in terms of sort of the limitations or, just even any thoughts on the settlement and thoughts about what direction we should potentially be pushing. We have a couple of minutes before we go back to our opportunity for public comment. So just really happy to hear from any thoughts from consortium members. I see Chuck's hand. And I think Matt, you're good, right? Okay. Chuck.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that, so we know that the state education spend is about $1.6 billion. The settlement is about $0.06 billion. So, I mean, it's great that we're talking about the flour on the icing on the cake because it's very important. But let's not forget the talk about the 1.6 and equity there. Some really tough subjects that we have not really gotten too deep into yet are, keep the unit count, modify the unit count, discard the unit count. There are going to be a lot of us on either side of that. And I think that when it comes to the flour on the icing on the cake, which is the settlement money, some of us that are that see merits in keeping the unit count are going to be pushing to have that integrated into the unit count. And so sometimes it might be, I think it might be good to have the larger discussion either alongside of, or maybe even before the smaller discussion, so that, if we have a recommendation that we can be consistent with that. Because, I mean, if we talk about, yeah, we're going to keep the unit count structure for the 1.6 billion, but we're going to do something totally different for the other money, it's got to make sense, and it's got to promote equity. I mean, we got to this place because a lot of folks do not believe that the 1.6 billion and the money that came before it was implemented in the most equitable manner. So I just wanted to put that out there.
No, I think that's great. Did anyone else want to respond to that? Ann, go ahead.
Not to have Christina capitalize on this time, but I just wanted to add that we also need to keep in mind that that we obviously are, as a group, we're formed around equity. But one of the things that was pointed out is that while this is going to have amazing potential impact on the city of Wilmington specific and northern Newcastle County, which is where our focus is, it also has statewide implications. Sorry, I couldn't come up with the word. And that one of the things that our system provides, while it didn't provide equity to all groups, it does provide a lot of equity statewide because it ensures a large portion of our funding. It doesn't matter whether you're north, south, it doesn't matter whether you can pass a referendum, can't pass a referendum. A lot of that funding is guaranteed, which provides equity. And I think what we're doing now, like we did a few years back by tweaking the special education, tweaking some other potential areas like EL, like students from poverty, like early learners, like K-3 basic special education. What we're doing now is identifying other areas where we needed to have targeted funding, and that this can provide, actually helps our system to be even a better mechanism of statewide equity, which you may not see in a system that is more heavily locally funded or based on local funding mechanisms. We're able to keep really strong equity because we have a statewide system. With that said, we can't miss that there's a second half to this settlement, and that second half to the settlement will have additional impact on that equitable funding. Obviously, we're not there yet. I just don't want that to be lost in the conversation that our system does provide a lot of statewide equity.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on those excellent points? I think that shows the urgency of, looking at some of those priorities that we already have in the funding and governance agenda, and really maybe getting a bit more specific about the timeline for addressing those, and not just when we expect to complete those recommendation conversations, but really when they need to get started. Because I think to Chuck's point, there's probably not a whole lot of reason not to really start digging into some of those deeper structural conversations, there's not really a reason to wait when we see, you know, plenty of reason to get the ball rolling. We just don't know how long yet it's going to be rolling to get to the finish line. But so I think that maybe for this subcommittee, as we pull that together, should be one of the first priorities is just let's look at these different components of the funding conversation, and when, you know, propose internally when we think those need to happen, that we can be agreeing upon, you know, as that holistic work group and as a consortium. So we just kind of know where we're going, and we can let other folks know as well, because I think having an uncertainty about whether and when we're going to be tackling those conversations, you know, we just don't need to have uncertainty around that. So I would prioritize figuring that out for that subgroup. And then of course, we just need to know who's going to be on that subgroup and make sure that we have, you know, the right representation, balanced representation there, and a plan for engagement, just like all of our other efforts. And we're about at time before we have our public comment period, but I don't want to leave anyone out in the cold. Any other comments and thoughts before we kind of wrap it up here? Okay, great. I do not see any hands. Don't see anybody waving. So, so with that, do we have anyone who would like to make a public comment, leave us with a public comment for this evening?
Amy messaged me and said she would like to give a comment.
Okay, Amy Solomon, you are up.
Thank you. With a big group, it's a bit nerve-wracking to give public comment, but so bear with me. But speaking to the holistic viewpoint and a timeline and things of that nature at the end, I think talks into my main point that I've had for quite a while now, is that from the outside where I am, I would like to see a holistic 5 to 10 year plan of how we're going to deliver equity by 2030. Because in conversations that I've had with Senator Lockman, you know, looking to the Kirwan Commission, for example, that was 26 years of work, you know, from their education lawsuit settlement, that they did the paperwork, the policy, they got their ducks in a row with their different equity studies, gap analysis, and economic assessment analysis. And what I don't know that we have in Delaware is where we've been for the past 50 years, what wins that we've had, and what kind of continuing resolutions. If we have a document that puts that all in one place. I did speak to Haley about this privately, and she said that she's heard that a lot orally, but maybe not in one document. And I think when we're talking the different components, we have the DOE, the executive branch, the General Assembly, and the districts, and we're all trying to organize and incorporate change and implement things at the same time and funnel it in. I hope some plan that can be transparent throughout this process, deliverable, and informed sooner than later, because I feel like we don't have one. And that from the outside is what I really need to know, that we're all collectively working on it, a transparent and joined up way. Because right now those 4 different entities don't work together. And I think that's why we have this broken system. So pouring the settlement money or even the opportunity money, and I have been to those advisory committee meetings, I made one, you know, pouring money into a broken system is not going to work. And I would just like to see it, if we can structure all this work that you're doing, which is wonderful, and quite a large volume, into some sort of clear implementation plan that everyone can access. And that can be an ongoing living document. But if we're looking to Kirwan or to Massachusetts, you know, in the early 90s to develop something that actually moves the needle for kids, I don't really see it visibly yet in tangible plans or implementation strategies like I do in Kirwan or these other places. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate it. Do we have any other public comment? Chester, it was good to see you too. It's been a while. Okay. Give it one more beat, and seeing no comments or waves or hands, I think we are good for this evening. Feels a little bit like dipping our toe in a vast ocean, but I have every confidence in everybody in this room, and even some of those who are not with us tonight who are part of this work. So I'm looking forward to continuing to tackle this and taking on this settlement as a great starting block, and sort of further push for a lot of things that we've already been working on. So thank you for coming and weighing in tonight, and we will keep you updated. I would say it seems to me through the Funding and Governance Committee, most likely at this point, on what our next steps will be. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice rest of your evening.
Thanks, Tizzy.
Mhm.
Good night.
Bye. Don't forget to save the chat.